Today's daf is daf Lamed Tes. We were discussing at the end of Lamed Ches Amud Beis two categories of dam and what their halachas are. One category is the dam chatos of the three matanos, which, according to Beis Hillel, are not indispensable. They're not critical. There's only one matana in chatos that's critical. Beit Shammai holds you need two. What's the status of the last three as far as the dam is concerned? Secondly, we were addressing the issue of dam shficha, which means the remnants of dam in the kos after the zrika was done that have to be poured onto the yesod hamizbeach. Now, the status of dam, as we saw yesterday, is relevant primarily to three different halachas. Number one, the halacha of pigul, whether a machshavas pigul is valid, so to speak. Again, valid to invalidate, that's the paradox here, but it's meaningful to generate the effect of pigul. Secondly, we have to determine the status of the dam as far as yotze is concerned, which means if, let's say, you set up an altar, a mizbeach outside the migdash, and you do an avoda with this dam. And finally, number three, the question of kibus. There's a whole parsha in the Torah and a whole parak in Zevachim that addresses dam that was nishpach, that it ended up on a garment, and whether or not that garment requires kibus. Kibus meaning washing, cleaning. Now, in terms of those two categories of dam, it would seem that at least before we get to Nehemiah, one of the Tanoim, we would have said that the dam of shficha has no real status of dam, and therefore you'd not be chayav for taking it outside the migdash, and it would not generate a chiyuv kibus, and certainly not a machshavas pigul. But in the light of Nehemiah, who goes on record explicitly as holding that dam shficha, if it's taken outside of the migdash, generates a chiyuv of chutz, we might be tempted to go one step further and say that according to Nehemiah, dam shficha would also generate a chiyuv kibus. As far as pigul is concerned, it would seem, as we go through the sugya today, that no one would entertain the possibility that you could have a machshavas pigul that affects pigul at the time of shfichas dam al yisod. In fact, it would also seem from the sugya, and all this is by way of introduction, that even as far as the three zrikos of Adam Chatos, after he brought the first zrika, which is absolutely critical, even if he has a machshavas pigul during any of those three avodos, meaning zrikos, it would not effectuate pigul. So without further ado, we'll take a look first at a brisa that's being quoted here on the top of Lamed Tes Amud Aleph. Domim ha'te'unim yisod. Now, the simple, straightforward interpretation of these words are the remnants of the dam in the kos. And the brisa tells us about those remnants that te'unim kibus, machshava mo'eles bahen, v'maylo bahen chutz chayav. The Reisha of the brisa, we'll soon see the Sefer, says that all three halachos of dam apply to dam haton shvichal gabi yisod. And we know that that's not true because there's no one who would entertain the possibility that the chiyuv kares for chutz, if you take it outside the migdash, would apply to dam shvicha. So, we're going to have to revisit this brisa. But the Sefer of the brisa says something simple, and that is V'domim anishpachim li'ama, but if you have dam that's absolutely possible, for example, the carbon was nifsal, then that dam, number one, eino tomud kibus, ein machshav melsved, mile behem pot. It means that that dam goes through a canal, and that's called nishpachim li'ama. We pour it out there, and as we said yesterday, it goes out there for fertilizer. Man shamet le di omer malo ben chutz chayev. Now, Reb Nechemia goes on record in a Mishnah as maintaining that the remnants of the dam in the kos, if you bring them outside the mikdash, you chayev kares. And therefore, Reb Nechemia, we have to attribute this brisa that says that domim hatu'unim yisod is malo ben chutz chayev to Reb Nechemia. We don't have a choice. Uka Omar, and yet he went a step further in this price in the Reish, and he said ton kibus, meaning that Rabbi Nechemi gave the dam hanishpach a full-fledged status as dam, but right, which means not only that chutz is chai, but also that it generates kibus. But the Gemara says that can't be because machshava moelas bahem. Is there anybody under the heavens that would say that a machshavas pigul at the time of shvichas adam would be mafagel the carbon? That's impossible. The carbon's already kosher at the time of the zrikas adam, and the remnants for shvicha, that's after the zrikas adam. Vatanya, we have a brisa yotzu shirayim vaktoras emurim she'ein ma'akvin esakapor she'ein machshava moelas bahen. The brisa says explicitly that shirayim, which are the remnants of the dam and the kos after zrika, and Haktoras Ha'imurim, which is another part of the Avoda, when the Ivarim and the Pdorim of the Imurim are taken and burnt on the Mizbeach, that's also after the Zrika, so they cannot be a Machsheves Pigul, right? Because it's not even Akivis a Kapar, the Kapar was already clinched. Ein Machshavim Moelos Bahem. So therefore we go back to our Brisa that says that with regard to Dam Haton, Yisod, which means Shvich al Gabi Yisod, there is a psul of pigul. That's impossible. So therefore, the Gemara says, Kitanya v'shol shmatona shebechatos. The subject of this brisa is not dam hanishpach. We're going to reinterpret the words of Te'unim Yisod, and the subject of this brisa is the three zrikos that are done on a chatos after the first zrika, which is critical. And the Gemara says, Yihochi tunim yisod. Why does the Brisa call the dam of these three zrikas of a chatos yisod? Has nothing to do with yisod. Lekerenosli. You have to throw them onto the keren, onto the corners of the mizbeah. Ema, therefore, will have to reinterpret this as nit'anim yisod. And what does nit'anim yisod mean? It means that it lends itself to shvicha on the yisod. And it means that in these three zrikos of a chatos after the first zrika, whatever is left in the three kosos requires shvicha al gabi yisod. So the Gemara doesn't like that either. Because machshava moelas bahem, if you're talking about the three zrikos of chatos after the first zrika, how could the brisa commit itself to the position that there's a pigul, a machshavas pigul, ha'amrit lo sharia v'lo mafagla v'lo ayla gavon b'sofan? We've already established this. We studied yesterday on Daf Lamed Ches, that as far as the three zrikos post the first zrika is concerned, they cannot effectuate pigul, and there is no psul in the carbon because he's already was zorek the first of the four. And if, let's say, you brought the dam, normally dam zrika, if it's brought from the Azor into the Hechal, that in effect, that what's the word? Invalidates the karba, but not here in this case because the karba was already validated by the first zrika. So if the dam in the other three kosos, right, the balance of the dam would be brought into the echel, it would not pass the carbon. The carbon's already achieved its kapara. So basically, we're now at the point where we're stuck with this price. So we don't understand how the price could be referring to the three additional zrikos of Adam Chatas on the three chronos and tell us that there's a Machshavas Pigul. Ela Kitanya hi Bidomim HaPnimim, right? We said as our introduction to this parak that there are two categories of chatos. There's a chatos chitzon and a chatos pnimis. Now, with regard to the chatos pnimis, there are very unique halachos of hazos, and we're going to see you need, seven, hazos lamala and seven one lamala and seven lamata and so forth and so on, the whole 9 yards. And we're going to see that with regard to a chatas pnimis, all four zrikos on all four chronos of the mizbeach hapnimi, we're now talking about the mizbach hazav, the golden altar in the heichal. They're all liikuva. All four of them must be brought. And that is the subject of the brisa. Now, we can understand, of course, now the brisa is simply because if we're talking about a chatas pnimis and all four zrikos are critical, then any machshavas pigul during any of the four zrikos would effectuate pigul. And we understand why the dam of any of those four zrikos, if it gets on the beged, would require kibus and machshavas pigul and so forth and so on. Everything's good. So the Gemara says, well, now if the brisa is focused exclusively on chatas pnimis, then the diuk should be aval bedomim achitzonim my potor. The Mishnah is the brisa is very strange. Why? Because the brisa jumps from one extreme to the other, from the case of chatas pnimis all the way to the case of what's it called, the Amma, and Nishpachim Li'Ama, which is completely on the other extreme, it's completely possible. So the Gemara is going to talk about Liflog V'Lisnei B'Didah. We've had that many, many times in Shas. Aval Dom Chitzon Mind Potter is added tani until you stretch your arm out all the way to the other extreme, to Dom Nishpachim Li'Ama, Liflog V'Lisnei B'Didah. Why not tell me, even as far as Dam Chatas is concerned, there are cases of Dam Chatas where these halachas, the three halachas that we discussed, don't apply. But Medvar Mamurim, Dafka, in the case of Dom HaPnimi, Aval Dom Chitzon Potter. Why did the Bryce have to go all the way to Dam HaNishpach B'Yama, which is Dam Posel? Why not talk about the Dam of the Chata, of regular Chatas, but not a Chatas Primis, but a Chatas Chitzona? So the Gemara says, Ha'mani Rab Nechemya hi. I'll tell you, even though this Brysa is addressing the case of Chatas Chitzona, and then we had a question because how could it be that Yechai for Chutz on the three Zrikos in the balance of the Avodas Hadam of a Chatas Chitzona, and then we're going to come to the conclusion that that dam needs kibus and that there's a machshava pigol hamafageles. So the Gemara answers, the Omar Shiori Dam Shekrim Bachutz Chayav V'lo Misnei Le Tlosa Pture Lebahadi Tlosa Chiyuve. So the Gemara now suggests that we go back to our original interpretation of the Brisa, that we translate the Brisa literally. When the Brisa says Domim Hatu'unim Yisod, it's really referring to Shvichas Domim. And we're going according to Reb Nechemya, who says that there's a chiyuv kares for chutz, for akrova b'chutz, in the case of dam shirayim hanishpach al gabi yisod. However, it's not true that all three dinim would apply to dam hanishpach, even according to Reb Nechemya. because it could very well be, we don't know, that Reb Nechemia might hold that the dam of shvicha does not generate a chi of kibbutz. In fact, the Gemara seems to be inclined in that direction. And certainly there's no machshavas pigul. So you're asking me, why did the Brisa jump all the way to the other extreme? Why not just say liflog v'lisnei b'dita and talk about, the dam chatos? Because the answer is that not all these dinim would apply to the dam chatos. So we have now a comparison in this brisa between the dam hanishpach al hayisod and the dam of echatas pnimis. And if you ask me, why didn't the brisa, when it was contrasting to the dam of a chatas pnimis, why didn't it mention, let's say, for example, the dam of the chatas chitzona? But the answer is because this brisa reflects the shita of Rabbi Nechemia, and therefore we couldn't get that contrast in all three dinim, because the dam of, let's say, for example, chatas chitzona would not be subject neither to, let's say, kibbutz, nor to machshavas pigul. Ravina has a slightly different interpretation of the Mishnah, and he says minakeren mamish. When the Mishnah, we have to split the language of the Mishnah into two. On the one hand, minakeren means minakeren mamish, right? So you've already been mekayim the mitzvah of zrika, the avodas hazrika was complete, and now some dam was collected from the keren, from the corner of the mizbeach. And mini yasod, but when it gets to mini yasod, meaning the dam on the yasod, mina royal yasod. So there's a certain inconsistency here in the brisa according to Ravina's interpretation. On the one hand, we're going to take the mina keren literally, and this is the dam that came out of the keren. On the other hand, mini yasod, we're not going to take that literally because we can't accept that dam hanishpach al gabi yisod would be subject to these three dinim, but rather we'll interpret it as something that would lend itself to shvich al gabi yisod, meaning that this dam, if there's any remnants, let's say, for example, in a chatos chitzona, would require a shvich al gabi yisod. Amalei Rav Tachlifa bar Gazel Ravina. Wait a minute. You're not being consistent in the way you're interpreting the words of the brisa. Ema, you should say that idi ve'idi royu. That if you're telling me that mini yesod is only mina royal yesod, then you should apply that same literary interpretation or methodology to mina keren, and say that it doesn't mean literally that it came from the keren, but it means that which is roy, that which is fit for zrika. And that would mean that the Reisha of the Brisa is telling us that dam that was fit for zrika, for example, the last three zrikos of a karmachatas, does not require kibbutz, which is okay. All right. Now, the Gemara goes on to the next part of our Mishnah. Kol anitonim al mizbeach hapnimi. In the case of a chatas pnimis, and we mentioned in our introduction to this parak that there are 5 categories of chatas pnimis. Maybe we'll go over that. All the requirements of avodas hadam are critical. It's not like a chatas chitzona, we have one, and that's critical, and the others are a mitzvah. Tana Rabbanon, we learned in a brisa. Now this brisa is going to analyze a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Daled. It says in the pasuk, I'll read the pasuk here, V'osel lapor kasher osel lepar chatos kein yasalo v'chiper aleim hakoim v'nislach lahem. So the context of this pasuk that we're about to analyze in the Brisa is par helim dover shel tzibur. And the pasuk goes ahead. Now, par helim dover shel tzibur is a chatas pnimis. And the pasuk now goes ahead and compares it to the par kohen Mashiach. And that's also in Perek Dalid of Sefer Vayikra, but a little bit earlier in the parsha. So the simple pshat in the pasuk is that with regard to a par helim dover shel tzibur, the dam should be subject to the same dinim as the dam of a Kohen Mashiach. Now, what does that mean? It means that in both cases, whether it's par helim dover shel tzibur or par shel Kohen Gadol, the dam is brought into the heichal. There are 7 hazoyos towards the paroches, and then the dam is applied to each of the 4 kronos of the Mizbach Hazov. Any extra dam is poured on the base of the Mizbeach HaChitzon, and therefore we read the pasuk, and it reads very beautifully, and it says, "V'asa lapar," meaning the par helim dover shel tzibur, kasher asa leparachatos, like the Kohen Mashiach's parachatos, which is brought when the Kohen Gadol violates with an erroneous psak. Let me just double check that, make sure I didn't forget anything. Right, the Kohen Gadol is a Talmud Chacham, and he made an erroneous ruling, and he has to bring a special chatos. So let's go on. Tana Rabbana. The asa kasher asa. There are extra words in this pasuk. In the beginning of the pasuk, it says the asa lapar, and then it says kasher asa, as you've done to the par of the Kohen Gadol. Is ma bolu lamed? What is the essence of this equation, the analogy of this pasuk? And the answer is lichpol bahaza osa. Now, the word lichpol has a very specific meaning in Kodshim, because whenever the Torah repeats something, which is the literal translation of the word lichpol, it tells you that it's likuva, meaning it's absolutely critical. The limit in this teaches Shem Chiser Achad B'Kol Matanos Lo Osa V'Lo Klu. So the Torah is repeating, right, the requirement of the Zrika, the Hazos, to tell you that if you leave out any of the Hazos, then Lo Klum, the whole enterprise is invalid. Now he points out here, in the name of the Shita Mekubetzes, which is one of the most fundamental commentaries on Kodshim, that basically what the Gemara is now doing is it's telling me that in the par shel Kohen Mashiach, Yaseh v'Osa kasher osa. In other words, it's a repetition of what the Kohen Gadol has to do with his chatos, with his par lechatos. And it's telling me that the same requirements apply to a par helim dover shel tzibur. So if there's a repetition within the case of Kohen Mashiach, with regard to his chatos, that's telling you that it's absolutely kuva, because we're going to assume that the asa kasher asa is both referring to the Kohen Gadol. So there's a repetition telling you it's likuva, that every single part of the avoda is critical and indispensable. Then, with the analogy to Par Helim Dover Shel Tzibur, we're going to derive the same conclusion with regard to Par Helim Dover Shel Tzibur. Now, as we saw the pasuk, there's still extra words in the pasuk. So the Brisa continues, Eli ela matan sheva. Okay, fine. You have those hazoyos, 7 in number, on the paro, or keneged the paroches, not on the paroches. Shema akvos b'chol makom, that in any chatos primis, when the avoda requires sheva matonos, sheva, in this case, hazoyos. Again, we're not sure exactly b'chol mokom what that's referring to, but for that, I don't think we'll get to it today. The Gemara later on Daf Mem is going to come back to this b'chol mokom. But the Brisa asks, Dalid Minayim, what about the matonos on the 4 corners of the Mizbeach? Forget about the hazoyos right now. Talmud Lomer Kain Yas. So we're going to darshan the next part of the pasuk, which says Kain Yas. So we have now, number 1, that all Sheva Hazoyos are Ma'akvos. Number 2, all 4 Matonos are Ma'akev. Then the pasuk goes on and says Lepar, and that's referring to Zeh Par Yom HaKippurim, the special chatas of Yom HaKippurim. Now keep in mind, it'll probably come up later in the sugya that on Yom HaKippurim there's a par and there's a sa'ir. Right now the pasuk is referring to the par, because it says the osel par kasher osel par. So right now we're referring to paro of Yom, the par lechatos of Yom HaKippurim. So he points out here in the name of Rashi that basically this Brisa is going to darshan every single pasuk 5 different drashos to include every one of the 5 categories of chatas pnimis. So now we have Par Helim Dover Shel Tzibur as a chatas pnimis, and that's the subject of the pasuk. We have Paro Shel Mashiach. Now we've added number 3, the special carbon of Yom Kippur, meaning the power of Yom Kippur.